He sat in the rear of the limousine in practiced silence, a titan of industry accustomed to the world bending to his will, unaware that the next red light would dismantle his reality forever. Through the polished glass, he watched the city pass with a detached air, his tailored suit and calm presence radiating a wealth that felt like impenetrable armor. People on the sidewalk glanced at the darkened windows with envy, sensing the power moving among them. Nearby, a man crouched low in the gutter, his eyes hollow yet piercing, tracking the limousine's progress with a frantic, painful recognition. As the vehicle slowed to a halt, the man suddenly lunged forward, his hands, stained with the city's grime, slamming against the pristine window with a force that made the interior cabin shudder. Without a word of plea, he pressed his face against the glass, his mouth open in a raw, silent scream that mirrored the billionaire's own features. The street froze. A heavy silence descended as pedestrians stared in disbelief at the audacity of the broken man. Inside the car, Alexander stood stunned, a cold anger rising at this violation of his sanctuary, unable to comprehend such boldness from someone so discarded by society. The driver prepared to intervene as onlookers whispered harshly, assuming the man was merely lost to madness, never seeing the calculated desperation behind his frantic movements. In that moment, the man's breathing was heavy, his eyes filled not with a desire for money, but with a terrifying urgency, as if he were a ghost trying to claw his way back into the world of the living. Alexander looked closer, and the anger was slowly replaced by a sickening realization. He sensed a history in those eyes that went far beyond a random act of street violence. No one noticed the man's trembling hands or the way he pointed toward the car's vents, revealing a story heavier than poverty alone. That unexpected collision marked the beginning of a truth where status would face the ghost of its own creation. The man's outburst was not an attack, but a desperate intervention. As his eyes locked onto the air intake of the luxury car, where a faint, acrid smoke began to drift unnoticed by the driver, the billionaire inhaled slowly. An unfamiliar dizziness touched his senses, a toxic reminder of a past he thought he had buried. The man in the gutter whispered through the glass, not a plea for help, but a warning of the very trap Alexander had set for him decades ago, now returning to claim them both. The sun rose over the city not as a gift, but as a spotlight specifically calibrated for Alexander Kensington. From the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, the world below was a silent map of miniature streets and inconsequential lives, all of which seemed to exist merely to support the towering glass pedestal upon which he stood. He dressed with the precision of a soldier preparing for a triumph, the silk of his shirt cool against skin that rarely felt the unmediated heat of the outdoors. Every movement was efficient, practiced, and profoundly lonely. The morning began with the hollow ritual of success. In the boardroom of Kensington International, the air was thick with the scent of expensive espresso and the electric hum of high-end service. As Alex entered, the chatter died instantly, replaced by a wave of standing ovations that felt more like a physical pressure than a genuine gesture of warmth. He moved through the room like a ghost in a bespoke suit, nodding at men whose names he didn't care to remember, accepting accolades for a quarterly growth report that felt like a work of fiction. Brilliant move on the acquisition, Alex, a senior partner beamed, clapping him on the shoulder. Alex offered a tight, professional smile, though his eyes remained as cold as the marble lobby downstairs. As the applause swelled, Alex felt a familiar, creeping numbness. He was surrounded by the highest level of human approval, yet the silence inside his own chest was deafening. He looked at his hands, the soft, uncallous hands of a man who moved numbers instead of bricks, and for a split second, they felt alien to him. He remembered a different kind of morning, a lifetime ago, when the air smelled of salt and grease, and a voice identical to his own had laughed beside him in the dark. He shook the thought away, drowning it in the cold clarity of a billion-dollar merger. By the time he descended to the private garage, his mask was perfectly back in place. He stepped into the waiting limousine, the heavy door closing with a pressurized thumb that sealed out the noise of the city. He was the golden twin, the savior of the family name, the man who had turned a tragedy into an empire. He pulled out a leather-bound folder, his eyes scanning data points that confirmed his dominance, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that he was a man holding his breath underwater. The car glided out of the shadows of the building and into the blinding midday light. Alex adjusted his tie in the vanity mirror, staring at the reflection of a man who had everything, unaware that the ghost he had spent 20 years running from was currently crouching in the mud just 3 blocks away. The limousine moved through the heart of the financial district like a shark through deep water, silent, predatory, and untouchable. Inside, Alexander kept his gaze fixed on a tablet, the blue light of the screen illuminating the sharp, tired lines of a face that appeared on the covers of magazines he no longer read. The city outside was merely a blurred backdrop of grey concrete and steel until the car began to slow, the smooth rhythm of the journey faltering into a series of jagged, frustrated stops. The driver's voice crackled through the intercom, apologetic and thin. "I'm sorry, Mr. Kensington. There's a protest blocking the intersection at 4th. It looks like the police have closed the lane." Alexander didn't look up immediately. He simply sighed, a sound of weary impatience. "Find a detour, Marcus. I have a luncheon with the governor in 20 minutes. "I can't, sir. We're boxed in." Alex finally raised his head, looking out the side window. The world was suddenly very close. A sudden, sharp afternoon rain had begun to fall, turning the city's dust into a slick, dark grime. Beyond the glass, a sea of people moved with placards and megaphones, their muffled chants vibrating against the car's reinforced frame. To them, this car was a symbol of everything they hated. To Alex, they were simply an inconvenience, a delay in a life measured in billable seconds. As the rain intensified, thick droplets raced down the tinted window, distorting the shapes of the pedestrians. The car sat motionless in the rising heat of the exhaust. To pass the time, Alex's eyes drifted toward the curb, where the sidewalk crumbled into a clogged gutter filled with debris and oily puddles. There, huddled against a rusted lamppost, was a shape that didn't move with the rhythm of the protest. It was a man, crouched low, his body draped in a coat so worn it seemed to be dissolving into the wet brick behind him. At first, Alex saw only the tragedy of the aesthetic, the messy hair, the unkempt beard, the raw poverty that his foundation spent millions trying to address from a distance. But then, the man shifted. He leaned forward, his hands pressing into the filth of the gutter as if he were trying to push the earth away. As the man turned his head toward the stuck limousine, the rain cleared for a fleeting second, washing the window just enough to reveal a face. Alexander felt a sudden, violent jolt in his chest, not of pity, but of pure, cold terror. The man in the gutter had a childhood scar just above his left eyebrow. He had the same deep-set eyes that Alex saw every morning in his own gilded mirror. It was a face Alex had spent 20 years pretending had never existed. The man's eyes locked onto the tinted glass, staring directly at where Alexander sat hidden in the dark. He wasn't just looking, he was recognizing. And as the man began to rise from the mud, his mouth twisting into a manic, desperate shape, Alex realized the barrier of glass and wealth had never been as thick as he believed. The man in the gutter didn't just rise, he uncoiled like a spring rusted by years of neglect. Alexander watched, paralyzed, as the figure lunged through the rain. There was no grace in the movement, only a feral, desperate gravity. A sudden, hollow thud echoed through the cabin as a mud-stained palm slammed against the reinforced glass, followed by another, and then the sound of fingernails clawing at the window as if trying to peel back the very fabric of Alex's sanctuary. "Mr. Kensington, don't worry, the doors are locked," Marcus's voice came through the intercom, strained and alert. "I'm calling security." But Alex couldn't hear him. His entire universe had shrunk to the few inches of space between his face and the one pressed against the outside of the window. Nate's features were distorted by the curve of the glass and the intensity of his rage. His mouth opened, a dark void in the middle of a tangled beard, and though the car was soundproof to the highest specifications, the words seemed to vibrate directly into Alexander's marrow. "I'm the reason you're rich." The scream was a physical blow. It tore through the layers of silk and ego, acting as a key to a vault Alex had welded shut 2 decades ago. Suddenly, the grey, rain-slicked street of the present dissolved. The smell of the limousine's leather was replaced by the suffocating scent of floor wax and old wood. He was 20 again, standing in a sterile hallway outside a wood-paneled courtroom, his hands shaking so violently he had to hide them in his pockets. He remembered the weight of Nate's hand on his shoulder that day, the hand of the twin who had always been faster, stronger, and more protective. "You have the scholarship, Alex," Nate had whispered, his voice steady even as the bailiff called his name. "You're the one who makes it out." "I'll tell them I was driving. I'll tell them the drink was mine. One of us has to be clean." Alex had watched his own face, Nate's face, be led away in handcuffs, while he walked out into the sunlight, cleansed of his sins and ready to inherit the world. Every dollar he had made since, every skyscraper with his name on it, was a brick laid on top of Nate's discarded life. A sharp crack against the window snapped him back to the present. Nate was howling now, his teeth bared in a manic grin of agony, his forehead thudding rhythmically against the glass. The golden twin looked down at his Forbes magazine, at the polished, successful man on the cover, and felt a sudden, sickening surge of vertigo. The man in the gutter wasn't just a beggar, he was the architect of Alexander's empire, and the bill for 20 years of silence had finally come due. The memory arrived not as a fading thought, but as a violent immersion into a night that had never truly ended. Long before the tailored suits and the boardrooms, there was a rain-slicked back road and the blinding glare of high beams reflecting off a twisted guardrail. The air had been thick with the smell of burning rubber and the sharp, metallic tang of an ending world. Alexander sat behind the steering wheel, his breath coming in jagged, terrified gasps, staring at the motionless figure on the asphalt, a life extinguished in a second of youthful, drunken arrogance. Beside him, Nate had been the first to find his voice. While Alex's mind had fractured into 1,000 shards of panic, Nate's eyes had cleared with a devastating, sacrificial lucidity. He looked at Alex, then at the bottle on the floorboards, and finally at the future that was about to vanish for both of them. "The police are coming, Alex," Nate had whispered, his voice steady against the rising sirens in the distance. "If it's you, the scholarship is gone. The law firm, the career, the family name, it all dies right here in the mud. I was driving, Nate. I killed them," Alex had sobbed, his forehead resting against the cracked steering wheel. "It's over." But Nate had already been moving, his hands firm as he unbuckled Alex's seatbelt and shoved him toward the passenger side. The exchange was frantic, a desperate choreography of shadows. By the time the first blue lights crested the hill, Nate was in the driver's seat, his hands gripped white-knuckle tight on the wheel, his face set in a mask of grim resolve. "Listen to me," Nate had hissed, grabbing Alex's collar as the sirens wheeled closer. "You're the one who can build something. You're the smart one, the one the world actually wants. I'm just a brother who gets into fights. Let me take this. I'll tell them it was me. I'll tell them I stole the car. Nate, you can't. I am. Nate had cut him off, his eyes burning with a terrifying, selfless love. One of us has to be the Kensington the world respects. Swear to me you won't waste this. Swear you'll make it worth it. The pact was sealed with a look, a blood oath between two boys who shared a face but were about to inherit two very different universes. Alex had watched from the sidewalk, innocent witness, trembling in the cold, as the handcuffs clicked shut around his brother's wrists. He had watched the light die in Nate's eyes so that it could shine on his own path. It was the greatest gift a brother could give, and the most horrific crime a brother could accept. The silence inside the limousine felt like a tomb, heavy with the weight of 20 years of silence. Outside, the rain continued its relentless assault, washing the grime of the city into the gutters. Alexander remained motionless, his eyes fixed on the man who was his own shadow made flesh. Nate's hands were still pressed against the glass, but the frantic scratching had slowed into a rhythmic, desperate thrum. He looked exhausted, the energy of his initial outburst beginning to leak out into the cold afternoon air. As the car shifted slightly in the gridlock, Alex's gaze dropped from the window to the street below. There, in a large, oil-slick puddle beside the curb, he saw a phenomenon that made his heart skip a beat. The angle of the light and the dark tint of the car created a perfect, mirrored overlay. In the rippling water, Nate's reflection was superimposed over the silhouette of the limousine. It was a fractured masterpiece of irony. In the puddle, the fine, expensive lines of the car's chassis were cut through by Nate's disheveled form. The reflection of Alex's own face, visible through the window's dark surface, seemed to merge with Nate's image in the water below. It was impossible to tell where the billionaire ended and the beggar began. The debris floating in the puddle, discarded wrappers, cigarette butts, and city silt, clung to the edges of the rich reflection, staining the Kensington prestige with the reality of the gutter. Alex realized then that the puddle was the only place where they were still truly twins. In that dirty water, the hierarchy of the world was inverted, the gold was mixed with the mud, and the success was indistinguishable from the suffering. He saw the fractured nature of his own soul reflected back at him. He was the surface, polished, gleaming, and reflecting the light, but Nate was the depth, the dark, heavy sediment that allowed the surface to exist. The man in the gutter looked down then, catching his own reflection in that same puddle. For a second, Nate stopped screaming. He stared at the distorted version of his brother's luxury dancing in the filth at his feet. He looked back up at the window, his expression shifting from rage to a hollow, haunting sadness. It was a look that asked a question Alex wasn't ready to answer: was the view from the top worth the price of the man at the bottom? The limousine's engine hummed, a low vibration that felt like a heartbeat, but in the reflection, the empire Alex had built looked as fragile as a bubble about to burst in the rain. The heavy silence inside the cabin was shattered by the sharp click of a door lock disengaging. Marcus, the driver whose secondary role as a bodyguard was usually a formality, had already placed a gloved hand on the handle. His eyes, visible in the rearview mirror, were fixed on Nate with the cold, clinical assessment of a man identifying a threat. He didn't see a brother, he saw a vagrant obstructing a high-value asset. "Sir, I'm stepping out to clear the path," Marcus said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Stay low. The crowd is starting to film." Alexander watched as Marcus's door swung open, letting in a sudden, violent rush of city noise, the cacophony of the protest, the hiss of tires on wet asphalt, and the raw, rhythmic thudding of Nate's fists. Marcus moved with the practiced efficiency of a predator. He rounded the hood of the car, his posture tensed, his hand reaching for the tactical baton at his hip. The contrast was agonizing, the well-fed, disciplined strength of the bodyguard closing in on the hollowed-out, shivering frame of the man in the gutter. Nate didn't flinch. He remained pressed against the glass, his eyes still locked on Alex's hidden silhouette. He seemed to welcome the coming violence, as if a physical blow would be less painful than the 20 years of invisibility he had endured. Marcus grabbed Nate by the shoulder, his fingers digging into the thin fabric of the brown coat, and began to wrench him away from the vehicle. Nate's boots slipped on the oily pavement, and for a second, he looked like a broken marionette, his face twisted in a manic grin of defiance even as he was forced toward the mud. Inside, Alex felt a phantom pain in his own shoulder. He saw Marcus's arm draw back, a movement designed to subdue and discard. In 3 seconds, Nate would be pinned to the ground, his face pressed into the very puddle that had just held their shared reflection. The Kensington name would be protected. The golden twin would remain unsullied. But as Marcus's fist tightened, Alex saw the childhood scar on Nate's brow ripple with the strain. He saw the man who had walked into a prison cell so that Alex could walk into a boardroom. The air in the limo suddenly felt thin, as if the oxygen were being sucked out by the vacuum of his own cowardice. His hand hovered over the button to the rear door. To push it was to commit social suicide, to invite the cameras, the scandal, and the filth inside. To leave it was to watch his soul be beaten in the street. Marcus began the swing. Alex's finger descended. The electronic hiss of the door's seal breaking sounded like a gasp for air in a room that had been dead for 20 years. The pressurized seal of the limousine door broke with a sharp, pneumatic hiss that sounded like a final breath. As the heavy door swung outward, the artificial silence of Alexander's world was instantly incinerated by the roar of the city. The raw, unfiltered chaos of the protest, the rhythmic beat of the rain on metal, and the screech of distant sirens flooded into the cabin, stripping away the illusion of his untouchability. Alexander stepped out. His polished Italian leather shoe, worth more than the man in the gutter had likely seen in a decade, sank into the cold, oily slush of the curb. The transition was jarring. The climate-controlled stillness was replaced by a biting wind that whipped his silk tie over his shoulder and stung his eyes with the scent of exhaust and wet pavement. Marcus froze, his arms still raised to strike, his face a mask of profound confusion. "Sir?" "Get back inside," the bodyguard shouted over the din, but Alex didn't hear him. He was looking at Nate. Without the dark tint of the window between them, the shed face was a revelation of horror. Up close, the resemblance wasn't just physical, it was a spiritual ache. Alexander stood in the rain, his bespoke suit beginning to soak through, darkening to the color of the iron sky. He didn't stop until he was inches away, standing in the same debris-filled puddle where their reflections had merged moments before. For the first time in 20 years, there was no glass, no lawyers, and no prison bars between them. They stood on the same broken asphalt, breathing the same polluted air. Nate's eyes, bloodshot and swimming with a decade of accumulated trauma, searched Alex's face with a desperate, terrifying hunger. The manic grin had faded into a trembling lip. The man who had been a ghost was suddenly solid, his heat and his smell of tobacco, damp wool, and neglect filling Alex's senses. The crowd of protesters slowed, cell phones rising like a forest of digital eyes to capture the impossible sight, the city's most powerful man standing in the mud, mirroring the posture of a beggar. Alexander felt the cold water seeping into his socks, the grit of the street under his heels, and for the first time since that night on the back road, he felt grounded. He was no longer the golden twin looking down from a height, he was a brother standing in the wreckage of a life he had stolen. Nate reached out, a trembling, grime-streaked finger touching the lapel of Alex's jacket. "You're wearing my life, Alex," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rain, yet louder than any boardroom applause. "How does it fit?" Nate didn't wait for an answer. Instead, he pulled back his sleeve, revealing a jagged, puckered line of scar tissue that ran from his wrist to his elbow, a relic of a prison yard brawl where he had fought to protect a face that no longer belonged to him. He leaned in closer, the scent of the street clashing with Alexander's expensive cologne, and began to recount the years in a low, jagged staccato. He spoke of the nights where the walls of a 6x9 cell felt like they were crushing his ribs, of the way his mind had fractured during months of solitary confinement, and the hollow, gnawing hunger that had become his only constant companion since his release. "Every time I saw your face on a billboard, Alex, I felt the ghost of a meal I didn't eat," Nate rasped, his eyes burning with a lucidity that was more painful than his rage. "Every zero on your bank balance was a day I spent in the dark. You didn't just take my freedom, you took my time. You took the decades where I was supposed to fall in love, build a home, and grow old. You bought your skyscrapers with my years." Alexander stood paralyzed as the realization settled into his bones like the winter chill. He had always framed his success as a tribute to Nate's sacrifice, a way to make the pact meaningful. But looking at the hollowed-out man before him, he saw the grotesque truth: his fortune wasn't a tribute, it was a harvest. He had thrived because Nate had withered. He had remained clean because Nate had absorbed every speck of the filth. The polished mahogany of his boardroom was made from the same wood as Nate's prison bunk. The Kensington prestige was a hollow shell, and the meat inside had been fed to the wolves so Alexander could escape. The cameras of the onlookers continued to whir, capturing the billionaire's knees finally buckling. Alex didn't fall to the ground out of a desire for drama, his legs simply could no longer support the weight of the lies he had told himself. He looked at Nate's hands, rough, scarred, and trembling, and then at his own, which were soft and useless. The great Alexander was a fabrication, a character played by a man who had let his own twin be devoured by the world. "I thought I was saving the family," Alex whispered, the rain washing the salt of his tears into the mud of the gutter. "There was no family left to save, Alex," Nate replied, his voice dropping to a hollow echo. "There was only a winner and a shadow. And the shadow is tired of being walked on." The sirens of the protest seemed to fade into a rhythmic hum, the shouting of the crowd becoming nothing more than the sound of distant waves. Alexander looked at the limousine, the black, armored beast that had carried him through a life of sanitized lies, and saw it for what it truly was, a rolling coffin for his conscience. Marcus stood by the open door, a sentinel of the old world, his hand still hovering near his holster, waiting for the order to return to normal. But there was no normal left to return to. Alexander reached out, his fingers sinking into the rough, damp wool of Nate's coat. He didn't offer a hand for Nate to kiss. He gripped his brother's forearm with a strength he hadn't known he possessed. With a slow, deliberate heave, Alex pulled Nate up from the mud. As Nate stood, shaky and gaunt, Alex didn't recoil from the grime that transferred onto his own tailored sleeves. He embraced it. He pulled his brother close, the expensive fabric of his suit acting as a sponge for the rainwater and the bitterness of the gutter. "Marcus," Alex said, his voice quiet but carrying a finality that silenced the nearby onlookers. "Go. Take the car. Tell the board I won't be coming in. Not today. Perhaps never." Sir? The security protocols. The protocols are dead, Alex interrupted, turning his back on the vehicle. He didn't look back as the limousine eventually pulled away, a dark sliver of ego disappearing into the grey city mist. Alexander stripped off his coat, the garment Nate had pointed to as the price of his life, and draped it over his brother's shivering shoulders. The cameras continued to flash, recording the fall of an icon, but Alex felt a strange, terrifying lightness. He had spent 20 years climbing a mountain of gold only to realize the air at the top was unbreathable. They began to walk together, two men with one face, moving away from the lights of the financial district and toward the unknown. The puddles they stepped through were no longer mirrors of a fractured identity, but simply water on a path they would finally walk as equals. Alex realized that his wealth had been a cage, and the gutter had been Nate's cross. By choosing the mud, he was finally choosing the truth. Being rich had been a performance for a world that didn't care. Being a brother was a debt that could only be repaid in presence. As the rain continued to fall, washing away the last of the Kensington polish, Alexander realized that for the first time in 2 decades, he was no longer a ghost in a suit. He was a man, walking home beside the soul he had nearly lost, finally understanding that the only true poverty was a life lived without the courage to be seen.